Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Du, and I'm a third year in the college studying law, letters, and society and data science. I'm originally from Virginia, and I'm also a co-chair of the tech team at the Institute of Politics, where I focus on promoting discourse around tech policy and ethics. I spent the past summer working at a think tank in DC, also working on tech policy issues and research around AI policy and geopolitics. I'm fascinated by China's rise as a technological superpower, considering Chinese industrial policies and R&D investments in things like AI infrastructure, hardware, and EVs. To dive into the geopolitical, economic, and security implications of the topic, tonight's panel features Emily Feng, international correspondent for NPR and author of Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, Identity and Belonging in Xi Jinping's China, which is actually for sale outside. She will be joined by Kelley Currie, former US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, and founding partner of Kilo Alpha Strategies, a geopolitical advisory firm. Third on the panel is Dr. Yangyang Cheng, IOP Pritzker Fellow and UChicago alumna. She actually did her PhD in physics here. She's also a research scholar of law at Yale Law School and co-host of the Crooked Media podcast, Dissident at the Doorstep. The panel will be moderated by Bill Bishop, author of the blog Sinocism, which promotes public discourse on China and its foreign policy. Before we start, I just want to remind everyone to please silence your phones, and after the panel, a microphone will be placed in the audience for Q&A. Students will be given priority for the first questions. We also strongly encourage guests to visit politics.uchicago.edu for more upcoming programs and opportunities at the IOP, including 2 upcoming speaker events. Next Tuesday, November 11th at 2:45 p.m., Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth will join us at Idenoise Hall for a conversation commemorating Veterans Day and more. And on Monday, November 17th, the IOP will host Dr. Susan Menares, the first Senate-confirmed director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, whose tenure was cut short earlier this year. And that event will be at 5:30 p.m. at Bond Chapel. And now, please join me in welcoming Emily Feng, Ambassador Kelley Currie, Dr. Yangyang Cheng, and Bill Bishop with a round of applause.
Hi, good evening. Thanks everyone for coming out. Lovely Chicago night. I thought it was supposed to be cold here, but I guess that's coming in a couple of days. So really excited. We have a really terrific panel, some really, I think, accomplished and knowledgeable speakers. I will say Emily's book is terrific. I saw it for sale outside. I highly recommend it. It's one of my best favorite China books. So I think to start out, really, I want to I think kind of frame. We have the sort of the framing of the topic here. Certainly when you look at sort of where is China and innovation, the last year especially, we've seen this, wow, they're leading in electronic vehicles, they're leading in batteries, they're leading in clean energy. We had the DeepSeek moment earlier this year. And I think and then just 2 weeks ago, the Communist Party had their 4th plenum where they sort of approved the framework for this coming 15th five-year plan that'll be approved next March, where a lot of that is about really pushing out the frontiers of science technology, both in terms of innovation as well as building out the ecosystem to build China into a global science and talent powerhouse. And so this is a really timely topic. So I think, and the backdrop, of course, is the US-China competition. Starting in the first Trump administration, we had, I think, the first round of pretty significant export controls that were fairly narrowly focused. They were specifically around semiconductor-related equipment, some chips, and then those were expanded in the Biden administration and have been continued through the second Trump administration. And so we're in this moment, I think, where there is intensifying competition. The Chinese are, I think, clearly believe this competition will only get more intense, and I think they are really putting in place roadmaps to, I think, what they believe to be really become the leading science technology power in the world. So that's the framing to get into this conversation, which is the first question for the panel, and I will let you all pick who goes first. But how successful has China been in building out the tech industries of the future? And why do we think in some areas they've been successful and why in others not so much? Who would like to take that?
Oh, I thought we were going in order.
Sure, okay. I can begin. I mean, okay, so what do we mean by dominance? I think it's important to set parameters here. In some ways, if we define dominance as just getting really, really good at something and being so good that you have almost a bottleneck over it, China's been dominant in different kinds of technology and manufacturing for decades, since the 80s. Obviously very low-end manufacturing, but even for things like semiconductors, we've relied on China to do things like quality testing and packaging of chips for years and years and years, especially for things like memory chips that are used in many, many electronic and cars and things like that. But now China's moving up the value chain, and I think that's what has made headlines over the last couple of years. I also don't know if dominance is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the way that global economies work is that you have some countries in some areas that are better at doing things than others, and you complement each other in those in those supply chains and industrial supplies. I think what's concerned people is that now, especially with the trade discussions this year, and this ongoing trade war, like the last 8 years of my career has been covering the US-China trade war, and it's getting a little bit old. But this year, the threat, which is still hanging over the US's head, it's just been delayed by a year, of these really sweeping rare earth controls, I think has raised the issue of dominance to another level, where countries not only have realized they have, and this is not just China, the US has bottleneck control over other technologies, but countries realize they have these controls over key technologies that are somehow, in ways big and small, embedded in all of our devices and systems across the world, and are starting to flex them. So that I think is new. And then to get to your point of how well has China done this, not just is it dominant, but how well has China done this? I think they've done it very, very well. The question is, could they have done it in a more efficient manner and on a faster timeline? And I remember when I was covering the rise of semiconductor manufacturing in China, you saw the same story that happened in solar panels. I spent a couple of months, a couple of years ago, looking at just the rise of how China has entered capital-intensive technologies that require scale to be efficient and to be powerful. And these are industries where there was incredible state investment and incredible domestic competition that resulted in a lot of wasted talent and capital investment, because you'd have these like 4 or 5 giants that would emerge by the end, and then 3 of them would go bankrupt, and only 2 of them would emerge, and then 1 of them would be forced to look for markets outside of China, because even the market in China wasn't big enough because the prices had been driven so low. The same thing happened with solar panels, and the same thing happened with semiconductor manufacturing. But also, China's economy was able to soak it up in a way. Like, the volumes of money and the volumes of sales that came afterwards were enough to absorb that kind of cost. So in short, yeah, I think they've been really successful, but it could have been done probably at a much less wasteful scale.
I would add that I think that, yes, I think misallocation of capital is probably a huge problem when it comes to how China has done this. But for me, the biggest question when I think about China's innovation cycle and how they set a plan, Xi Jinping set a plan in 2015 with Made in China 2025. They have also been working toward what they call the dual circulation economy, which politically intends to make China less dependent on others for inputs into their economy, while making others more dependent on China for pretty much everything. As Emily described, it's this movement, it's not just movement up and, not just holding on to low value manufacturing at some level. I mean, a certain amount of it has been exported, especially to countries in the region, but there is still a lot of low value manufacturing happening in China. There's still a lot of middle value manufacturing in China, and they continue to move up the value chain to higher and higher value manufacturing, while also trying to build out their own tech stack that is indigenous, that's not reliant on the U.S. And they recognize these bottlenecks around high-end chips, around chip design, around some of the other things where, yes, they've been doing the packaging and testing for a long time, but every time up to fairly recently when they've tried to develop the kinds of cutting edge, bleeding edge chip technology that allows, for instance, US AI companies to create the kind of compute power that they rely upon to be able to build out these large language models, they have not been successful up to now, despite putting massive resources into those efforts from the state and a lot of support and a lot of insistence that domestic producers and domestic users from the military to the commercial side use indigenous technology. They've still struggled with certain aspects. And so I think that while yes, you can see with setting these goals around Made in China with the critical the critical technologies that were identified in Made in China 2025, for the past 10 years, there has been huge progress toward meeting those targets. And I think you can say from their perspective, they have made excellent strides and have done a good job, but have not yet hit the mark on certain things that they really want to. When it comes to things like the rare earths bottleneck, a lot of that technology is not particularly sophisticated. So I wouldn't even, I mean, some of it is, a lot of it is manufacturing processes and things that were created in the West. These were technologies that were developed in the West, but then we did not want to do the kind of extractive manufacturing and producing of critical minerals, and it's a dirty business. Mining and processing these minerals is very, very, very dirty. It's very damaging to the environment. And so there's not a lot of interest for the past, even after the incident with Japanese fishing boat in 2011, where China cut off Japan from access to critical minerals at that time. And that was a wake-up call for everyone, but only the Japanese seemed to take it seriously and move to reduce their dependence on Chinese-produced and extracted critical minerals. But China continued its march across to a point of really high dominance on these materials that now form the bedrock of a lot of the modern technologies that, I mean, again, the mineral technology itself is not critical, but what the minerals go into is bleeding edge technology. And so that's where they're able to create, through kind of lower end processes, a bottleneck on higher end processes and on higher end technology. And I think that, again, we utterly failed to recognize and to meet the challenge there, and to understand that the ability of Beijing to use brute force economics to destroy markets, when we did try and make some half-hearted efforts to push back on the critical minerals issue, that they were able to destroy markets and drive any company that required commercial success or had to meet market discipline could not survive having these markets flooded. And so I think that we're now at a point where we have to, the ability to mobilize mass and scale to throw at these problems raises a fundamental question about whether there's always been this assumption or presumption of this very tight linkage between innovation and free society, especially since the end of the Cold War. One of the, I think, things that we told ourselves, one of the stories that we told ourselves out of the Cold War was that we had better tech, and that's one of the reasons we won, and one of the reasons we had better tech was because of freedom and open inquiry and our system of political freedom that allowed for academic and freedom of inquiry in the sciences, and that allowed us to innovate in a way that a closed or authoritarian society could not. I think now we have to really press that question and ask ourselves, is that link broken? Has China broken that link through sheer mass and application of scale and mass to problems, and what does that mean if so?
Wow, well, both of the panelists have said a lot, so there is not that much for me to add, but I'll give a little bit of context, right? Because I think there is often a lot of misconception, and some of that is racially coded, is Orientalist in terms of thinking about technological development in China. That either the Chinese people are like culturally backwards and they can only copy and steal to get ahead, or the Chinese people are somehow sinister, like Fu Manchu, the Marvel villain, like they have some like this kind of like Oriental wisdom, and they're going to like use evil technology to take over the world. And some of these dichotomies we're seeing, for example, in the perceptions of where the COVID-19 virus came from, right? It's either Chinese people are primitive and they eat bats and that's what caused the pandemic, or the Chinese people like built this in the lab. And so when we talk about technological development in China, what we are seeing is there is unevenness, and some of this is historical. And if I take one example, for example, semiconductor development, if we look at some of the government plans back in the 1950s, like the first 12-year plan for science technology development, and semiconductor, or back then it was called integrated circuits, was named in one of the major points. However, there were historical reasons that this field did not develop, partly because of Mao-era campaigns with scientists with foreign education who are persecuted on one hand. On the other hand, this pursuit of math science that indeed to a degree trained large groups of Chinese people without formal education to be able to build transistors and conductors from scratch. But that is a way to like train the masses, but it's not a way to particularly like develop cutting edge technology. So there are historical reasons. And then in the reform era, the Chinese government and the Chinese public recognized this issue and is trying to catch up, but there are different incentives. And so these incentives have caused certain types of unevenness in terms of China's technological development. As both of the panelists mentioned, right? China has been able to dominate by scale, in terms of volume and speed. But one thing I wanted to mention here is that scale is not something that is just mindlessly copying. There is innovation in it, both in terms of tacit knowledge that is hands-on in terms of the workers who are actually doing the manufacturing, and also in terms of managerial skills, that is in terms of managing a supply chain, managing logistics, and how to perfect the efficiency. And also in terms of the actual product itself, that when it's being manufactured at scale, there is tinkering that continuously improve it. And so there is dominance for a lot of traditional tech sectors in China in terms of that. But as the Chinese economy develops, it is facing a similar trajectory as a lot of other developed industrial societies. That its manufacturing sector is becoming stagnant, so it's trying to push into these new sectors. And in these new sectors, we see some unevenness because of the incentives. There are certain areas where there is a lot of market incentives, and also there is fast money to be made. So that's why we are seeing a lot of these software companies that are becoming dominant, like these internet companies like Tencent or like TikTok, as we're talking about here, right? But there is some lacking in some of the hardware capabilities because that takes a lot of capital investment, and it also takes a lot of time to really develop the technology. And so that is an area that for up until quite recently that the Chinese society in general has been lagging behind. But the geopolitical competition, these export control restrictions have created the additional incentive on top of the Chinese government's own nationalistic agendas that are creating these incentives. So we are seeing the Chinese industries is catching up or even taking the lead in some of these traditional, these hardware design and manufacturing sectors. And then there are these new sectors in terms of clean energy, and we are seeing when it's new, and then there is market incentives. And so Chinese people's entrepreneurship is manifesting in that. And that is where we are seeing the Chinese companies are also becoming dominant.
Can I add one thing? Because
Sure,
Yangyang brought in such interesting historical context. This emphasis on technology, and by corollary, science, has been in this narrative of Chinese self-strengthening for more than a century. It's been core to political reforms and even revolutions in modern Chinese history. And so there's always been this emphasis on the idea that previously starting from kind of an anti-imperialist framework to now an economic framework, that science and technology were key to developing the Chinese nation eventually. I think what's changed in this centuries-long rhetoric about how important technology is to Chinese leaders in nationalist times and revolutionary times, now in PRC times, the change has been from a strictly how can we as a people fight off colonialism to technology being a core part of China's economic model going forwards. And it's not an assured thing. Like the idea that China can become dominant in technology and that it can work for a new model of its economy that can then grow and sustain the livelihood expectations of 1.4 billion people is actually a huge gamble. And I think we're at this really, really interesting hinge point right now of can China pull it off? I mean, the downsides of not making an economic transition to some kind of looking for new productive forces is very, very high. And the chances of going forward, the risks of going forward and changing their economic model completely to these manufacturing heavy, hardware focused technologies is also incredibly high. So I don't think, to get to the heart of maybe the title of this event, that China's dominance is assured. It's actually a very, very risky and very daring and very ambitious plan that they put forth. But it's also not a new thing. This idea that technology is not something that the West can safeguard. It's not something that the Chinese people are inherently better or worse at, but that it is central to national development has been there for a long, long time.
Thank you. No, and it's interesting the idea of plans. I mean, there's multiple interlocking plans over. I mean, we're now getting to the 15th five-year plan, and I think there was the 863 plan, right, which was around sort of science, technology, self-reliance that was pushed, I think, and started in the early 80s. And so I guess one of the lessons it seems like is actually planning, industrial planning. It looks like at least now China looks pretty good, right? I mean, this is the endless debate here in the U.S. is sort of it's been, I think, along what you said about how if you're not free, you can't innovate, which I think we're obviously learning is a bit too dogmatic. There's also if you have industrial planning, then you'll automatically fail. And I think, again, that maybe is being shown to be too dogmatic. So one of the questions, actually, I'll start with you, Yang, if that's okay, is you mentioned sort of talking about semiconductor development and how in the 50s, because any scientists or experts with foreign connections were suspect, and because of Mao's campaigns, it sort of caused a lot of problems in many sectors. And not all, like you had Chen Chuisun, right, in the space sector who came back from the US and obviously built the entire space program, or was the father of the space program. One of the things that comes out, we've seen Xi Jinping talking about it for several years, and it's really prominent in this latest, the outline we've seen of the forthcoming 15th five-year plan is how China has rebuilding their entire science technology kind of education and development system, and also they're really trying to attract global talents to become a sort of a science technology highland for the world. In a way that I think, historically, that's what America's strength has been, right? I mean, we've been the country that attracts the best and brightest from around the world. And China is going for that. They're, I think, putting a lot more funding into science technology. So the question really is, China, can they succeed at that? Can they actually start attracting the best and brightest talents from around the world to go study and do research in China?
Oh, this is a really interesting question. And if I may, I can follow up a little bit on on the context you just mentioned. Since you mentioned the 863, so this is it is named this way, Baliusan, because it was a joint letter written by veterans of the Chinese space and nuclear program. So these leading scientists wrote this joint letter in March of 1986 to the top leadership, to Deng Xiaoping at the time. And this is an interesting context, right? Because this was the time it was still early in the reform era that China is abandoning its earlier socialist model to embrace global capitalism, and is trying to rebuild its industry, rebuild its educational sectors. And there is a narrative at the time was that China needs to catch up, and so it should be like relying on foreign tech transfer and relying on these traditional manufacturing sectors to quickly rebuild its economy. And these leading scientists made this suggestion is that if China wants to become a strong nation, then it needs to also have a place in terms of high-tech, a high-end science technological development. And so this is what the 863 program came about. And in the US, sometimes it's being called like China's Sputnik moment. And in that context, leading to Bill, your question about attracting foreign talent, one thing that is actually quite interesting is, as you also mentioned earlier, right? Just now, the proposal for the 15th five-year plan just came out, and if you compare the language in that with the last one, the 14th five-year plan, there is one thing that has changed. In the 14th, a number of things. It's consistent, but there are interesting difference related to Bill's question is in the 14th five-year plan, it says to explore attracting high-tech immigration. And in the 15th, it says to establish attracting high-tech immigration. And so it seems like the government kind of has made this decision that this is a good thing. However, we also saw, like for example, recently when the Chinese government announced the so-called K visa to attract foreign talent in these desired sectors, there is huge societal pushback. And so this is complicated because even though the Chinese society it is an authoritarian society, but the government is still in some ways beholden to public pressure. In a lot of different things that we see that the government has stepped back or delayed certain certain policies, for example, like raising the retirement age because of public pressure. So in terms of immigration policy, this is very, very difficult because there is also an overproduction of people with advanced degrees in China, and they are and youth unemployment rate is also very high. So what is the actual capacity to be able to attract foreign talent without all the other elements about whether others coming from other countries would want to live in China or under an authoritarian society? That is another question. But I would like to add an addendum, Bill, to your question is whether or not China needs that, right? It has domestic talent, it has this base, it has this capacity. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like a little bit of a political stunt to say we are going to, now that the United States is closing its doors, we're going to welcome those of you who want to do scientific research to come to China. And so sometimes it does feel a little bit like more political messaging than a meaningful thing that is really going to happen or is really going to have much of an impact, I would say, in terms of technological development in China, because your point about overproduction and overcapacity, it's not just in electric vehicles, it's also in engineers and computer scientists and people with advanced degrees. And you mentioned, I mean, the youth unemployment problem is so severe that they've stopped publishing the statistics about youth unemployment in China. And so there is this element, and it goes back to what you were saying also about, Emily, about the shifting of the economic model. And every time that, when China does this historically, it does create a lot of internal instability and puts a lot of pressure on what is essentially a pretty brittle regime that has lost a lot of its sources of legitimacy over time, and it still relies on performance legitimacy to a high degree, I would say, and appeals to nationalism, and then coercion operating in the background, the kind of the anaconda and the chandelier concept that of the party state there, even if it's not present and making itself visible in your life every day, everybody knows it's there, and so I think these are very open questions about what this transformation is going to mean in terms of, here in the United States, we're worried about AI taking away blue collar and white collar jobs and all kinds of jobs and the destruction of jobs in this country. And you've got to, and so in China, I think that there was a sense that, we've got to, with our demographic crisis, the population decline, maybe AI and some of these things and robotics can help alleviate the worker shortage. But AI, robots aren't going to be paying taxes. Robots aren't going to be, they're not. True
communism.
But somebody's got to pay for the state, right? I mean, where does the revenue come from? And robots also can't have children, so where do the people come from? I mean, it's really, I think that there is an element of futurism and utopianism always in communist political systems, and a high degree of utilitarianism operating when they're thinking about policy choices. and I wonder the degree to which that is going to come down to a point that becomes quite untenable over time.
Did you want me to weigh in?
If you don't, you're up to you. Yeah.
I was just thinking, I remember when the 1,000 Talents program came out, I had a bunch
So
of...
remind the audience what that program is.
Yeah.
when did it begin, Yangyang? Maybe like 15?
In 2008, because my undergraduate supervisor was actually among the first cohort of 1,000 Talents.
So I remember, I was like, this is around when I was, in high school. But I just remember a bunch of family friends decided they were going to start working in China. They lived in, Chinese born, like my parents moved to the US in their 19, 20, their early 20s. And after 30 or so years in China said, this looks pretty good. I'm going to go back and see if I can get an academic appointment in China. So a lot of really, really gifted people of my parents' generation did go back, and they ended up running into a bunch of legal issues because they unfortunately had both a job in China and were taking a full-time salary in the US. And then, the Trump administration came in, and I when I was living in Beijing, I met up with a bunch of these family friends had moved back, and I was asking them about how their research was going. And this was a while ago. This was almost a decade ago at this point, but they were running into some of the rigidity of these academic institutions where there was more they were not used to the kind of oversight and political maneuvering, and so I think that some of them had some falling outs, they had some patent issues, they had business disputes. I think that those are getting better. I think that institutions realize that they need to work more with people of international backgrounds, but it's a process, and I think that process might take longer than China would like to hope for. But as Yangyang points out, there are so many people in China who are incredibly intelligent and well-educated that I'm not sure they are thinking that they're relying too much on overseas talent, or at least non-ethnic Chinese talent to power their innovation in the future. I don't think they really need that. But yeah, the 1,000 Talents thing was interesting because it was just, everyone in, I think, the English-speaking world was so worried that China was poaching these people and whatever, and actually the rollout was rockier even in China than people realized.
Yeah, I thought thank you so much, Emily. I thought I would just make a little addendum here that in terms of foreigners, actually, Emily has this really good book called Let Only Red Flowers
I'm very
Bloom.
flattered that everyone's
that is about the boundaries of Chineseness, because Bill's question was about attracting foreign talent. Of course, people of Chinese ethnicity who hold foreign passports are technically foreign, even though the Chinese government does not see them as foreign. And so in the Chinese government's language, I think now in terms of attracting foreign immigration, it is a new development in terms of attracting people who are not ethnically Chinese on one hand. On the other hand, in terms of attracting overseas, like the Chinese diaspora, to come to contribute to the motherland, this has been a long-standing policy. And for a long time, it was not considered controversial because it is considered talent flows and knowledge flows are indeed beneficial to the global public. But with the U.S.-China tensions, and we are seeing how people who have hyphenated identities like Chinese Americans were being caught in the middle when they sometimes made procedural mistakes or sometimes were just being caught into these geopolitical tectonic shifts. So this is just an addendum in terms of how we define foreigners here.
But I think you also have to, maybe it is getting easier on an administrative level, but the ideological rigidity is getting worse in terms of under Xi Jinping and how that is affecting the universities and the ability to, it's less of a problem, if you're doing STEM, but there is that ideological rigidity that is, it's infusing. There's a lot more political education, a lot more study sessions required, and continually proving your loyalty to the party state. And the degree to which that's either, can you contain that within the Chinese citizen population? Do you push that onto the return diaspora? And then how do people who are outside of both of those, on the third circle outside of that, how does that relate to them? I think, I think that's a real challenge for them to be able to not just attract, but retain people and get people to stay.
And one of the things they're doing, there are some new universities. I think there's one called Westlake University, right? Which is quite well funded, and I think is trying to be sort of more modeled in more of a sort of relatively open inquiry. I believe they actually just attracted someone from University of Chicago. A well-known University of Chicago scientist just is now full-time in China. I forget his name. But also, again, I should have been more clear. Originally, it was more about the overseas diaspora attracting them back to China. And now I think, though, like you said, they are actually trying to just get sort of non-diaspora global talent.
Yes,
and that is really, I think, to what you all said, I think that is a bigger challenge. But I think my view is one of the challenges is we in the U.S., our policies are making it easier for them potentially.
100%.
Yeah, that is true, but I also would like to add a note here, especially for someone like myself who actually, when I came to the US for grad school here 16 years ago, the I House was where I spent my first 2 nights before I moved into my apartment. And then I often hear this kind of arguments about like brain drains or reverse brain drains, and I would like just to comment that I'm not a brain, right, like I'm a person. So I think it is also important when we are talking about technological developments, really understanding that it's people who are being impacted, and there is a human cost to this, and not like abstract people by just their like intellect, like the degrees they hold or whatever economic output they have or the perceived intellectual output they have.
Well, but this is where that utilitarianism problem in the communist system rears its head, right? If you don't see people, as you see them as instrumentalities and tools to advance some party goal, then you can, the technology loses that. And that's where I think, for all of our problems right now, I don't see us moving in that direction, even if we start flirting more with industrial policy and state capitalism and incorporating certain lessons learned from, looking at what China has done, what they've been successful with. Are there things there that we can learn from? But I think that avoiding that tendency toward pure utilitarianism has got to be central to how we think about what we do going forward. I'm deeply concerned about this when it comes to AI, especially because of the dehumanizing can I think of that word? Dehumanizing aspects of AI. They're very inherent, and there was a very interesting conversation, I'm trying to remember where I was hearing this, about how AI and authoritarianism are in some ways a match made in heaven because they share that AI's DNA is quite authoritarian in a way. And so whether this is going to be a way that how AI is going to empower authoritarianism because it's an inherently authoritarian technology, and what are we doing as a society here in the United States to deal with that and some of the downstream effects of it that we're already starting to see.
Or AI makes societies that aren't authoritarian more authoritarian. No, it's a different topic, but it is a fascinating question. But following along the question on scientists is and it ties into the fact that we are at one of the great institutions of higher learning in the world. Is when you look at the history of U.S. and China scientific technology cooperation, collaboration, it's a very rich history since the early mid 80s on. And obviously a lot of those ties are fraying. And I think for some valid reasons, some not so valid, but definitely there are some real risks involved. How can and should those kind of collaborations continue as the U.S.-China competition seems to be only sort of on an intensifying trajectory, and it seems like to increase? And related to that is a question for and I'm sure the leadership here at Chicago and other big universities think is, how should universities, what should they be doing to manage this kind of risks of collaboration with China, but also the risks of complete decoupling?
Oh, this is a fascinating question. Okay, Bill, you said like U.S.-China academic exchange and scientific collaboration has a rich history since the mid-'80s, and I would say since the mid-1880s. And so one thing that I say is that the history of U.S.-China academic exchange and knowledge exchange is as old as U.S.-China relations, and it has gone through different cycles of tightenings and openings. And so if we only look at the history of the 1980s, I would like to take a small step back, right? If we look at US-China relations had been worse before. If we look at the 1950s, when the two countries had very limited direct interactions and effectively no personnel exchanges in science and technology. However, there is still influence from US science on scientific development in China, even when it was primarily following a Soviet model in Mao's China at the time, right? There were US and European country trained Chinese scientists who went back to China, who were writing curriculum, training students. There was also large quantities of textbooks and journals that are published in English in the US or in the UK or in other Western countries that are being acquired. And this is a dedicated effort by the Chinese government to learn the most advanced the latest scientific developments from Western countries, even when there is this is a Cold War divide. And the students and the students of the earlier generation of overseas returnees who went back to China in the 1940s and 50s, their students, some of them came back to the US and in the reform period, including someone like myself, right? And probably including Emily's parents. And so I think if we look at, if we want to understand educational exchange, we need to place that into a longer and larger context. This is not about, this year, like we need to stop China from purchasing these chips. And so these certain people we cannot admit Chinese students from this institution or not, or we need to shut off certain scientific collaborations. These are very narrow and very nearsighted way of understanding how science technology develops and what education is for. And then coming back to Bill's question about how do an academic institution or how do university leaderships respond? And I think the key question here is not even about how many Chinese students study in the US or how much direct collaboration there is between Chinese scientists and China-based scientists and US-based scientists per se. I say per se, because the fundamental question is, if Chinese students are not coming to the US to study, if there are very little or no more collaboration that is taking place between the scientists in these two countries, that has a profound impact, and that is an indication of what kind of scientific projects are being pursued, right? Why is this process exclusive? Who does the product of this research serve? And these are fundamental questions. And as I mentioned, because scientific pursuits and educational efforts have generational impacts, and we see there are the educational institutions and the scientific infrastructure that are shaped by World War II or by the Cold War are still influencing how science is conducted and how research is conducted today, decades later after the initial hostilities have ceased. So the decisions we make now have generational impact as well. And so coming back to university leaders, the question is also, the answer is to history, right? The oldest institutions in China and the oldest institutions in the US, for example, my employer, it is older than the US, the Declaration of Independence or the US Constitution. And so what is the responsibility of a university? What is its answer to history? What kind of knowledge it wants to produce? What does it see its mission as? And then finally, the note is that as academics, as students, as knowledge workers, right, we have the power to decide what kind of knowledge we want to produce, who it benefits, whether it's for the global public or whether it's for very narrow state interests or corporate interests. And so I think that is the answer. It was just for university leaders, they have an answer to history. They need to be able to understand their power. And I also think this is not a question that is just laid to the university leaders. We have seen how people in elite positions of power have been behaving. I think this is really the question that is to the community, to the people, that the public need to understand their power and to be able to organize and leverage their collective power.
So I would put this a little bit differently. I think look, I've always kind of believed if Chinese students want to come to the United States and study liberal arts, we should give them a 10-year multi-entry visa or stamp a green card in their passports if they want to come here and study liberal arts, because I think that would be extremely enriching for both the universities and the students to do that. I think that since, however, the passage of the national security law that compels companies and researchers to turn research that's of value to the military-industrial complex in China over to the party state, otherwise, you get into trouble. It's against the law not to provide that information or any development or research that you're doing, or any innovation that you're having over to the party state. And because of civil-military fusion, which doesn't distinguish, there's no more dual-use technology anymore, especially as technology as every technology can be weaponized and used as a weapon of war now, and we've seen the capabilities there, and we see it every day, whether it's in the cyber domain or drones or AI. I think that the dynamic around this, it has had a chilling effect on all sides. You have a chilling effect in the United States where we have to be careful. When we're seeing that the Department of Defense is funding research on critical cutting-edge defense technology with institutions that are affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, this is a problem for the security of this country, and it has to stop. We've got to deal with it. Institutions of higher learning have to deal with it. They have to recognize that this is a threat to American national security. I can't be any plainer about it. But there's also been a chilling effect in China as well, where if you go back to China with your newly minted degree from an American university, you can't get a job anymore. It's not the hot ticket that it used to be. And so I think we're seeing this chilling effect from the great power competition on both sides. It's not just a problem here, and it's also, I think, it is not just that the Trump administration has put up barriers to students or has sent out signals, we don't want you to come here and we're going to cut off funding to basic research. There have also been very, very strong signals, or very at least mixed signals, from the Chinese leadership about the reliability of Chinese who come to the United States to study, and questions about that. And so I think that is, these things aren't going to get better. I think they're only going to get worse, unfortunately. And yes, universities can continue to hold forums like this and should continue to try to create learning environments that foster academic freedom. And I applaud the University of Chicago for being a leader in that area of insisting on academic freedom and protecting the students who come here so that they're not being harassed and subject to transnational repression, and that there's open expression around all kinds of issues here. But that's what the universities, I think, in the United States need to be doing more of.
But is it binary around STEM, or can it be certain areas that really
I just think we have to be really, really careful. The track record is clear.
Medicine, what about, the problem is biotech can be dual use too, right? So how does a policymaker or an educator draw the line? And how do you weigh the costs between, especially in sort of biotechnology and medicine, where collaboration might really yield some wonderful discoveries to cure cancer, save lots of lives? How do you? I don't think I'm just. No. How do these universities think about this?
Yeah, it's going to be tough. It's going to be really, really hard going forward. And these are choices that have been pushed on the United States. I want to be very clear. The Chinese Communist Party passed legislation.
It takes two to tango.
Yeah, this is not just a one-way, we're bad and suck at everything. There are things happening. Other countries have agency in this too. And the People's Republic of China has agency in this. And you see, we're still having massive scientific cooperation with lots of other countries, and that will continue. I think that, this is a blip in terms of, this administration's policy. I think they will, even within the administration, start to see that it is not a good idea to drive the smartest and best, brightest people out of this country.
Let's hope so.
I certainly hope they will see that.
I think what is important, though, and I spent a number of years reporting on the China Initiative, which parts of it have come back informally, but the FBI was running to go after alleged industrial and intellectual espionage in the US, is if you do want to set guardrails for what kind of applied technology might be a national security threat or dual use if it's shared, that you need to have scientists and academics who are designing that policy, because the vast majority of these cases are going after basic research and basic collaboration, and were completely counterproductive by and large, I think that universities work mostly with basic research, fundamental research into technology whose applications we cannot even begin to imagine because they're 5, 10, 50 years in the future. And I would, to be utilitarian about it, Kelley, I would rather accept the security costs of opening our doors and saying public knowledge and global cooperation is historically almost always for the benefit of humanity, and accepting the security cost and being really, really, really conservative about putting restrictions on those collaborations over security concerns and prioritizing that collaboration. But if we're going to put restrictions in place, I just haven't seen the kind of input from the actual academic and scientific community to analyze what are some of the security implications of that. And for Chinese students who come here, the data has borne out, by and large, particularly in STEM fields, they stay and they work in the US, and that's remained remarkably consistent up until the last 2 years.
Okay, well, thank you. I have lots more questions, but we're going to open up for audience Q&A. One thing I will say is just on the sort of growing restrictions. I mean, it is bipartisan, though, right? Because we saw it really start the first Trump administration, the China Initiative. The Biden administration actually continued a lot of these policies. They rebranded them, they talked about it in a different way, but the actual fundamental shift inside the government, I think really it was fairly consistent in its trajectory. Great, well, let's start with questions, please.
Hi, yeah, my name is Krim. I'm a second-year Masters of Public Policy student at the Harris School. Just wanted to ask a question about more regionally applied in terms of the conversation regarding in Southeast Asia, specifically some of the countries such as Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand have seen huge investments, foreign direct investment from China. I'm sort of curious to y'all's thoughts on how, in terms of that innovation and investment is being made, in cooperation with these countries. Do you think in the conversation, the themes that have been talked about today, it's a cooperative stance in terms of sort of a more regional neighbor aspect? In my mind, as an American, thinking about it from the U.S. and the Latin America relationship perspective, it's a little bit different. So I'm curious to y'all's thoughts on how China's innovation investment throughout the region in Southeast Asia sort of is along the lines of cooperative in that nature.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount, but the United States is still either at parity or in some cases a bigger investor in some of the countries that you mentioned than China. So it goes back and forth actually with a lot of the Southeast Asian countries in terms of who is the biggest investor. I think that they're up until this year, when you go around and you do the Asia Barometer surveying and talk to the business communities, the United States remains a partner of choice. They don't want to have to choose, though, and that's what you always hear is don't make us choose, don't make us choose. And so I think right now you have both the United States and China putting pressure on these countries to choose a path, and that's not, and they're very unhappy about it. The president's recent trip, he signed a number of deals with Southeast Asian countries, with Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and there's a long, the U.S. relationship with Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines is very intense. But China has very active neighborhood diplomacy, and they are, they take different approaches with different states. Their policy toward Laos is very different than how they deal with Singapore, for instance. And I mean, we could talk for hours about this topic, but I'll just kind of leave it there. I think that there is an element of both, of all of these countries trying to maintain sovereignty, maintain independence of action, while recognizing that they're kind of caught between these two big countries that are making life difficult, but also have a lot of upside for them as well.
The beauty of Southeast Asia, from a journalist perspective, is every country is so different in such a tiny space. So it's really, I think it's actually impossible to generalize about what China's investment stance is and what the Southeast Asian region's perspective is towards China. I spent the last 2 years living in Taiwan. Guess where their top foreign investment destination is right now? Southeast Asia. For the same reasons that China is also trying to move production offshore, why US companies are also looking to partner more with Southeast Asian based companies. So I think things are in flux in every country for political or historical reasons. has a different approach to doing business with China, the US, or Taiwan.
Great. Thank you.
And Japan.
Okay.
Oh, I'll just quick follow up really quickly since Emily mentioned Taiwan. Actually, Taiwan's investment in Southeast Asia predates Taiwan's investment in the mainland because when it was still under martial law. So this is not new, right? This is a natural outcome of economic development that when the country reaches a certain stage of economic development, it has surplus capacity that it needs to invest overseas. And so it is not just a geopolitical incentive, but there is an economic incentive. And again, like the cases in Southeast Asia are more complicated depending on different countries. But I wanted to highlight there is one book by the Hong Kong American sociologist Qin Huang Li called The Spectre of Global China that focuses on China's overseas investment in Africa, in particular in Zambia. And there is one comparative case that she made about Chinese investment in the copper mining in Zambia and how Chinese state capital might differ from Western private capital. And there are actually two interesting differences, even though both are exploitative. One is because Chinese state capital was looking for the copper for its use value rather than exchange value. And so it favors more long-term investment. And so a long-term investment and more stable labor force, and that translates into the workers have longer-term contracts, but at a lower pay compared with those employed at Western private capital invested mines. So that may be an interesting data point in comparison.
Thanks. Okay, next question. And just, I got a message from our management that we only have one panelist reply to each question.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you all. Because we only have 13 minutes left. I know we've got to keep tight to the schedule. So please. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Gabriel. I'm a incoming PhD student or first-year PhD student in the chemistry program here. And I just had a question about how we think about you might call it a demarcation problem in the types of science, basic versus applied versus military, and in turn, kind of how that relates to the types of institutions that do science. So historically, almost all research in the US has been in the university. Historically, there was Bell Labs, but that had faded away. Now some of that is starting to come back. There's interest in kind of alternative kinds of scientific models, nonprofit startup type organizations, et cetera. And I wondered, as we start to have kind of going away from the flow from pure basic research to applied research to industrial scale, we know in some cases it's helpful for scientists to go to the industrial scale to find useful problems. How will this new way of thinking about science and the organization of science affect this concern about military overlap or pure basic research, and in what institution?
I feel like Yangyang should take this one because he's an actual PhD.
Yeah.
That's all you.
This is a great question, but it's okay. So answer it in two aspects. Actually tied with what Emily mentioned earlier with regards to biomedical research and the China initiative. And so when we look at research in this country, right? Initially, like in the 18th century, in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was primarily philanthropically funded, and then outside of agriculture. And the federal government became the primary funder of basic research in academic institutions after World War II, and that was entrenched in the course of the Cold War. However, myself always find that these kinds of delineations are both helpful but also can be misleading with regards to basic research or applied research or classified research, right? And actually, coming to this point about sensitivities around scientific collaborations between Chinese entities and U.S. entities, and there is a lot of discussions about security. However, there are very few U.S. universities that conduct classified research on campus, and that is not inevitable. That is an outcome of campus anti-war protests in the late 1960s, where students and faculty members felt, the campus community members felt, that this is antithetical to academic freedom and also to the ethics of scientific research, that they were contributing to weaponry development, right? And so in terms of scientific collaborations, there is effectively none that happens in the classified domain in terms of Chinese students studying in the U.S. And so when it comes to basic research and applied research, this becomes murkier because of one important legal development in the U.S. in the 1980s, in particularly in 1980 by itself, with a legislation, which is the Bayh-Dole Act, that not just allows but encourages universities to patent their products from their federally funded research and license them for profit. Before that, in the decades before, publicly funded research, the results generally remained in the public domain. Another thing happened in 1980, which is a Supreme Court case, Diamond versus Chakrabarty, that basically says that life forms made by man can be patented. And so this is how like Monsanto has patented basically every seed under the sun. And these two legal developments created this hugely lucrative field that is biomedical research. And so coming back to earlier, when Emily mentioned the China initiative, this is a Department of Justice initiative, but there were parallel investigations that took place that were led by funding agencies. And guess which was the funding agency that was most stringent with regards to, that had most heightened scrutiny and had the most devastating impact in terms of lives and livelihoods?
Department of Agriculture.
It was the NIH. It was not the Department of Energy. It was not the Department of Defense. It was NIH. Why? Because this is a particularly lucrative field.
Research.
And so it comes back to earlier, Emily and Bill mentioned, and also Ambassador Currie mentioned ideas of security. There is often, like conventionally, one thinks about security is about military threats. However, through the course of the Cold War, and especially in the 1980s and 90s with US's economic competition with Japan, national security has increasingly grown to incorporate this dimension called economic security. So the very idea is that an opponent needs to be kept poorer so that they are also militarily weaker and less threatening. And so when we think about, so this is going off on slightly on a tangent, but I think this is important to coming back to the idea about how to categorize different areas of science, is that science as a human endeavor is inherently political. And there are political and social conditions that incentivize it. Even when scientists think they're only, like for myself, I was trained as experimental particle physicist. Actually, my doctoral advisor is here in the audience, so I'm very nervous that he may regret and take back my degree at the end of this. But even for a field that is as fundamental as elementary particle physics, there are also political and social conditions that come into it. So I think as scientists, it is probably more important not to rely on these categorizations, because these categorizations are by themselves political, right? What becomes considered applied, what becomes considered dual use, what is a weapon and what is not a weapon, and really think about what are the political and social conditions that support their research, and think about how to use one's own power as a scientist to shift these conditions towards research for the public good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we have just about 7 minutes left. I'd like to get at least 2 more questions in. So if you just ask the questioners to be very concise.
I got it.
Thank you.
Great job moderating, Bill, moderating the talent and distinguished panel. I'm going to cut down my question because I understand the time constraint. We talked about early on in this panel discussion about the lack of innovation, the link between lack of innovation and authoritarianism. And China seems to be breaking this link. Or maybe I think the link was not that reasonable, or maybe China is not that authoritarian after all. So my question is, we add to different dimension of the question of innovation, right? Because I noticed China has a lot of incremental innovation. Like China is not the one that invented the automobile, but they incrementally improved the automobile, ultimately like leading the market in terms of EV. And many other things. China has the best cell phone we don't get here, but China is not the one that invented cell phone or the smartphone or any kind of cell phone or even telephone. Right? China maybe have a better light bulb, but China is not the one that invented light bulb. So the question is, does China's innovation is limited to incremental, or it's not limited to incremental, or China still has to prove itself in terms of innovation in general, especially the revolutionary kind of innovation?
Do you want to ask a couple more questions? And then
Sorry?
Do you want to ask another,
line up
couple more
questions,
questions?
Okay, we got that one, then we'll take one more question, and then we'll take, is that all right? Why don't we do that? Yeah.
Hi, should I take it off? I'm a third year at the college, and my question is about security and what that means. I know that you touched upon what national security can include, including economic security. reading some reports like AI 2027 that does research about the US and China relationship and how having this like arms race is going to lead to safeguards not being met. And that would have a security impact on regular people who use AI on a day-to-day basis, who use it in business. And so I was wondering what you think national security means, especially in the case of AI, and what it should mean. Thank you.
Okay, so who wants to take the first one about innovation, and who wants to take security?
I
I can do innovation. Or
I want the second one.
Yeah, I would say
definitely
about
want
security.
national
Probably, you've lived it.
Okay, go ahead.
I love reading history of science books, and I love reading Yangyang's writing in particular because innovation depends on the human spirit, the individual human will, but it also depends so much on the collective material conditions in which you're operating. And I think when you point out that China has been better at incremental innovation in the past, it's because both the mixture of government policy and also just the natural endowments of how big the country is in itself has favored things like just things that require a lot of capital investment and scale to get better at. But I also think you're starting to see, particularly with the DeepSeek moment, that there are individual moments of innovation where China has leaped ahead of other companies. And the question now, with something like the proposed 5-year plan and the 15th Fourth Plenum, is can China create the conditions that then encourage and sustain individual innovation? And I mean, the jury is out, but I think that they can do it. It's not something that's existed in the past as much, in part because when you think about everything from starting the 19th century railroads to the computer revolution of the 20th century, those have been industries and technologies that have been dominated by Western standards. That is slowly changing, and so I think that the material conditions and the political conditions for that kind of innovation can encourage true, not just incremental, but true, I hate this word, disruptive innovations in the future coming from China.
So what does national security mean? Well, I mean, and I think now that, so I've never heard anybody describe the idea of economic security that way, that the idea is to keep other countries poor so you can preserve your national security. I mean, my understanding of economic security goes back to the way the Japanese have constructed it, that they need to be able to develop their economy in a certain way in order to be able to, I mean, it's true that having certain economic resources allows you in general to, there's a relationship between the ability to field a blue water navy and have an advanced military and your economic capabilities in most cases. It's not 100% overlap, but it's pretty close. So, for me, national security means doing what we need to do to maintain our way of life and maintain our independence of operation as a nation. And doing that within the constitutional framework of ordered liberty that we have as a country. And that last part is extremely important, right? Because if we maintain our national security, but we lose our constitutional government and our democracy, then what does it matter? I mean, at the end of the day. So I think that for us, our ability to maintain a functioning democracy in the United States is at the core of our national security, is the core of our strength. It is the core of what makes us the place that people want to come. And it's the core of what makes our economy so vibrant and dynamic. I do think we are in a period where we are contesting political systems, and that China has a very clear vision. They have, especially in the past 5 years, and especially under Xi Jinping, become much more open about setting China up as a model that, and by both inference and directly questioning that democratic market economy system is the best way to organize your society, and to really, they're really pushing on that belief that we have and that most of our democratic market economy allies have, and really testing it. But globalization and technology are also testing it. So our biggest national security threats right now are at home. And I definitely see that. But that doesn't mean that we don't face external enemies that we have to also be on guard and trying to deal with and ensure that we are protecting ourselves against. That's not a very straightforward answer, but it's the best I can do to a hard question.
Well, thank you, everybody. I really, big round of applause for our panelists. It was really fascinating. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody who came. Really appreciate it. Thanks.